All right. Hello, Matt. I'll start things off here. So just to kick things off, would you mind telling the SuperBio community a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Eva. So my name is Matt, head of engineering over here at Future House. My background was originally academic. I got a PhD in bioengineering, short program between UC Berkeley and UCSF. While I was supposed to be most days building systems that could help research cancer biology, I mostly spent my time actually building light microscopes, hardware and software, to enable both my own experiments of other folks in the lab. And after we basically published our technique, me and some colleagues in the lab, we spent or I spent most of the rest of my PhD taking it to different labs, both here in the Bay Area and around the country. So kind of like from early on in my career, I've been really focused in on building tools that empower folks to do new things that they weren't able to do before. So that was kind of the first half of my career. And since then, over the past 10 years, I've been working in industry in a variety of different roles. I've been a data engineer building backend systems for Fortune 500s. I've had my own startup where we're doing speech recognition for doctors and nurses for automatically filling out medical records. And I've also worked in healthcare for several years, running data and engineering teams, primarily in digital health. And then I joined on over here at Future House half a year ago now.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that answer. I'm curious specifically with respect to artificial intelligence. What led you to pursue a career that included AI? And which came first into your life, AI or bio?
Uh, Great question. I've coded for a long time. I've obviously had a lot of interest in biology. I did like biomedical engineering for my undergrad at Hopkins. Um, I think one of the interesting pieces for me, even like in grad school, is while my lab was over at like UCSF, we were basically capturing hundreds of thousands of images and running image analysis on it, right at the intersection of where basically a lot of the machine learning computer vision models were just taking effect. Like even though I was like at UCSF Parnassus, like AMP was just getting set up. So I really should have used more of the initial deep learning models earlier on in my career. We were doing a lot of like custom kernels for doing like object edge detection and tracking when I was in grad school. And running into a lot of the problems too, both on one and like the data engineering side. What if we can't actually process a data set on like a single machine? Like what do we do there? How do we use distributed systems? And then on the other side too is like, how do we leverage new techniques to have our systems actually learn about the behavior and be able to make predictions? So in grad school, I ran into a lot of those issues. And actually for me, the way that I jumped into career kind of in data science and engineering in 2015 is I did this program called Insight Data Science, which was for recent PhD grads looking to level up and kind of transition their career. So when I did the Insight Data program, I got a lot more exposure to, oh, how would I actually use these tools more in like the software engineering paradigm? And that actually is how I kind of rolled my interests over to both like kind of taking what I've learned and like my training as an academic, but also like make that industry jump there. So super early on though in my projects at first company I worked at grad school, Silicon Valley Data Science, I was doing both like building these backend systems for large biotech companies, but also doing like small fun projects of like how do we do real-time object detection on IoT devices? So like using Raspberry Pi as a proxy for that and getting some pretty impressive results that I never could have gotten with OpenCV, just using like early day inception models before like V1 of TensorFlow. So yeah, that kind of once I started getting into it, really started accelerating my path towards these are a new set of tools and technology that allow us to do new things in lots of fields, but especially in biology. So kind of been learning by accident a large part of the way.
That makes a lot of sense retrospectively. I'm curious looking forward, what is your biggest motivation to continue in the field?
Yeah, we're at like a very interesting time in the world of AI and biology. On one side, over the past 10 years, bioengineering, like giant advances in bioengineering and high throughput biology techniques have kind of led to a giant proliferation of data across many different, basically, modalities. Uh, like a good example of this is like our colleagues over at like CCI, like Chan Zuckerberg Institute, have made available like hundreds of different RNA-seq experiments using the exact same 10x genomics kit. So like the method is nearly exactly the same. The output of the data is the exact same format. How do we, as humans with limited time in the day, actually start tackling this? And with large amounts of just different types of atlases like available on cells and like other different like components and scales of biology, we have this preponderance of data on one side. On the other side, we're also at a really interesting time of where our large language models, and this is where we've had like huge advances over the past like year and a half. We've kind of gone from the jump of having models like I'm very used to using NLP models like in production, like pre-LLM world. But now we're basically having models that have been trained on nearly all of written human content ever. Like the writings of there's been what 100 billion people on Earth, 10 billion people have written stuff down, give or take, maybe a little bit more than that. And these models are trained on all of that. And while they're like autoregressive, like token guessers, there's a lot of power of being able to extract information from previous written literature and our ability to also use these tools. So that's where a big intersection point for me is like, how do we leverage that there's so much more data? Our ability to create data is more than we've ever done before at the same time of having all of these tools available now where we're actually able to potentially scale up our ability to do analysis, to do like semi-autonomous like hypothesis generation and experiment planning based on what's previously been done in the past. And how do we expand our ability as biologists, bioengineers to do this type of work? Um, we're kind of at this new inflection point of there's a lot of new tools and technology and kind of like opportunity to make positive impact in using these tools in the field.
I'm curious. I mean, let's take a step back and go to the pre-LLM times.
Yeah.
And you developed a digital health company that, leveraging mobile hardware called Lexicon AI, right? And
Mhm.
you alluded to this as well. Um, what was Lexicon AI and what's the founding story behind it?
Yeah, happy to take it a throttle back. So as I mentioned, I went to Hopkins. A lot of my colleagues there by the time that I was done with grad school and was working in industry were clinicians, basically working whatever, 8, 10, 12-hour shifts, and then spending 2 to 3 hours at the end of the day charting into electronic medical records. Um, on one side, like the advent of EMRs has allowed like the quality of healthcare to go up, but definitely has decreased the quality of both like patient clinician interaction as clinicians are basically focused in on entering notes as well as just like the time sink that it takes for different clinicians to do this, whether it be nurses, PAs, or doctors basically doing this documentation. So that was basically a really large pain point. And I'm sure anyone listening to this knows clinicians or have had visits in their life where they're like, I can't believe that documentation is taking so much of this visit away from the human component. So the big motivation, that was kind of like the problem space that I was pretty familiar with. And me and one of my colleagues, Ian Plosker, a friend of mine from my time at Hopkins, we were really seeing that there were being really large advances in speech recognition, specifically of like when we were going from uh, older school models to recurrent neural networks, the amount of errors that these models were having instead of being an error a sentence, it was going down to like an error a paragraph. Again, like kind of a sea change. So a lot of my focus and Ian and my focus at Lexicon was like, can we merge these two things? Can we be aware of what is the clinician workflow in a specific setting um, to basically be able to capture that information, as well as how do we make it so the note quality is just as high and that information captured saves time for those clinicians too. So that was kind of a lot of my effort and focus there is like, hey, there's been a sea change in technology. How can we leverage that in given workflows and extend it as well?
Thanks for the story about Lexicon. What can you tell us about your newest position at Future House?
Yeah. So Future House, we're a nonprofit moonshot looking to develop tools and technologies leveraging AI, specifically looking to develop semi-autonomous agents that can do science specifically. So a lot of our focus is in of like how can we kind of merge these different realms of both biology, bioengineering, and AI as well. So maybe like also like taking it a step back, maybe for the viewers out there, a big way that we think about like when science is performed, we kind of think about this general flywheel of science, of where you have hypothesis generation, experiment planning. You're taking previous known information to decide of what next steps and experiments you want to do. There are basically in silico and in vitro experiments that you can do to try and evaluate if the null hypothesis is true or not. And then there's analysis of like taking the output of those experiments and deciding on next steps. And that loop in science often takes a very long period of time. For anyone that's done science before or read about it in the scientific literature, it's very rare that science is linear and in that loop, and even more rare that you can basically do work in kind of like a physics flywheel analogy where you can actually hold momentum in that loop and take what you've learned and immediately do the next step and basically accelerate the amount of work that you're doing. So like here, when we think about what is like an AI scientist, what are AI scientific tools, we think about one is that we're building LLM agents that can do different parts of this stack, whether it be hypothesis generation, experiment planning, analysis, in silico experiments. And then me and my job, I'm head of engineering. So my job is how do we build that flywheel to connect those different agents that our individual scientists that are experts in those different pieces are building right now.
Hi, sorry. As usual, Wi-Fi basically stops working in the most inconvenient time. Sorry, I dropped off.
No
So
worries.
I'm curious. I think it's a fascinating topic of work to build an AI scientist. Um, During this time, what have been the most surprising or unexpected challenges that you and your team has encountered so far?
Unexpected challenges. I think some of the challenges, I think our challenges are multiple fold. Some of the challenges that we run into are what other folks that build agentic systems run into, like kind of on the engineering side. Happy to dive into those. There's also the side of how do we basically translate in silico work to in vitro and like take the learnings of there've been a lot of different like self-driving lab companies that haven't panned out in the science side. How do we like leverage where they've done well and where they've struggled? Yeah, and I think the third one too is we're a really evaluation focused company, where one of the biggest ways that we iterate and move forward is how do we build benchmarks of our system's performance. This is really critical on like the AI safety side of basically being able to score how systems perform, especially as we talk about biological systems, how they perform on our different safety metrics, but also just our outputs. So we built like scientific question answer systems that we'll probably get to. Some of this like paper QA, which is our system that we use in WikiCrow. So to do scientific question answering, leveraging the literature and using that to basically build ontologies. It's been very interesting seeing of where our systems have performed much above where we predicted. And in some cases, like at or like exceeding like human annotator like level, even experts in the field, and where there's still a large distance to go. And that these are like kind of large scale systems that have multiple agents in it. So a big piece of it too is identifying where are the bottlenecks in performance, like where do we actually have pieces of our system uh, not operating like at where you'd expect a human could be trained in this loop as well. So yeah, happy to dive into any of those places if that's helpful for you. But those are kind of a few different varieties.
Gotcha. I'm curious to help us sort of better understand. I'm curious, how do you envision sort of the future relationship between a semi-autonomous AI and a human scientist working together?
Great question. Great question. So the way that I actually envision it is we as scientists have our hypotheses and directions that we want to go in a specific field. Like when I was a PhD, I'll give my own example. If I had the system, uh, give or take 15 years ago, how would I have used it? I was a PhD and I was researching how do cancer cells migrate through the body and what were the important proteins that drove these changes. And through that, we could maybe identify new targets to try and stop cancer cells from invading. Uh, During my time in my PhD, there was a list of probably like 30 to 50 proteins involved in cell extracellular matrix adhesion. And I looked into two of them. One of them well vinculin, and one of them uh, very briefly as a collaborator called Pexillin. Um, all of the steps after I figured them out by year 3 of my PhD, I could have applied them to the other 50 and done the same set of experiments. I was relatively familiar with the literature, nowhere near an expert. What I would wanted to have been able to do is I know how to do this one thing really well, and I understand the system. However, there's 50 moving pieces, or in some cases in biology, there might be hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. I would want my AI scientist to work with me to do the other 50, or in some cases would be to do the other 20,000. That's how I basically see this extension being, is we take scientists that are able to do a certain amount of work, and we're not, I would say that most scientists, I would say basically all scientists that I know that are still like working in the field are not hypothesis limited. Obviously, you can rank order how many hypotheses you can generate. There's only so much time that you have to like do experiments and resources to be able to do them too. So it's like, how do you basically set the agent forth to explore with tools that you've built and technology that you have able to basically accelerate and empower scientists to do more than they could ever do as an individual. So like the type of problems that we tackle at Future House is like uh we've demonstrated, like we or other people have demonstrated that you can do X for Y, but there's 20,000 Y. How do you scale up and do that and basically accelerate that without having to get another 19,999 graduate students to go and do the same damn thing? Is that helpful for like kind of our context of where these pieces can be used? Um, and also it's hard to just rank them. You have to know so damn much about an individual, basically field of study of like what is the most valuable thing to go and do. And it's hard to read more than like one scientific paper a day. Maybe that's my limitation. But there's thousands of new papers that are published every day too. So it's like, how do you keep up and also have a wider set of synthesized knowledge to be able to not just action on it, but also like decide what is going to be the best thing to do next, considering what thousands of other colleagues in the field are also doing at that moment.
It, I mean, it's such an exciting idea to have, and hopefully a reality in the next decade or so, to have an AI scientist working with you. But it also sounds so powerful to give such vast knowledge and capability to an AI scientist, to an semi-autonomous agent. I'm curious if there are any, like you alluded to safety metrics beforehand. I'm curious if there are any specific scenarios or outcome that your team is actively planning to navigate, or any ethical dilemmas or considerations that like keep you awake at night.
Yeah, these are great questions. So there's a pretty burgeoning field like AI safety, especially when it comes to biology. And we're working pretty closely with quite a few different organizations of how do we, one, consider what would be a risk or would not be a risk of what individual tools can do, but also like really critically, how do we evaluate how these systems basically can use these tools or not use these tools. So for instance, like some of the things that folks are like kind of have top of mind are what are ways that you can basically locate or use information that can be used to like if we're talking about uh, let's say bioweapons are basically on that side, is what information can you gather both today about like a specific basically a specific threat, and what are resources that you can also get towards like moving forward towards like let's say using it. So a lot of different examples are out there, but a big piece of it is a lot of information has been like published before that is Googleable of what you can do there, but it's like how do you basically reduce the chance of harm if other people like use these tools? What is the steps needed that they would basically be able to change? Um, and does it lower the barrier for people to basically be using creating biological agents, if that makes sense?
And what's your take on the government's measure, like security measures, on if you're familiar with those? sort of around, how many flops a large language model has to be trained over. Do you find them enough of security measures, or do they make sense?
Yeah, I think in our space and in other safety in the agentic space, it's different and it's interesting because like if you would go and like take a virus name, like let's say a virus maybe that's been eliminated off the face of the earth, you can do a Google search and find what its sequence is. Like immediately, it's published and out there, and it's one Google search away. Creating a virus is very difficult, but there's tons of literature about like how you would basically go and create a virus. And having a lab that can actually produce that is also huge steps to be able to do it, but it's not like this information is unknown. So
Hmm.
like having a large language model that has been trained on the entire internet, it will have come across the things that I've basically like said there. The question though is like, what can you do with a scientific agent, like for these different pieces? One, I think it's important to know that like for agentic models, where you can go and do these Google searches and do like paper question and answer, it's basically the same as doing like a single Google search as an individual. I think a really, really critical piece for our safety and how we consider this as well is how do we evaluate models' ability to basically chain these pieces together? And is the model's ability to do it going to be transformative of what individuals would be able to do, or basically be able to accelerate there? So there's already existent risk of basically information like being out there. And like at this time, like I don't believe that like the models and agents that have been built really accelerate or change folks' ability to do various things in biology and chemistry beyond what is already Googleable. Like that can definitely change in the future. And a big piece of like what we are doing is there's some obvious places that you can do this. You can do this in guardrailing of LLMs. Like we have multiple members of our staff that have actually like red team with OpenAI and participate in some of these discussions at scale of basically how do you measure and basically try and prevent access to information that you don't want to make it easily accessible. Another place here for like our agent's ability to, let's say, um, find a sequence and like make a plasmid, like molecular cloning it with agents hasn't been solved. It's pretty close in a couple of different places. Will that dramatically change folks' ability to do nefarious things? Um, if you have like if you've done a biology undergrad, you can probably do those steps too. Once we start getting to the place of where you can basically chain these together, I think will be like a bigger discussion point. There's a lot of science that's going to be enabled and acceleration, but where checks do we want to do? And also what barriers do we want to put between these agents? I think is also a really key place that in the agentic space, an agent can only do so much and often will communicate in natural language to another agent to do a next step. And that also seems like a very logical place to basically, for when we think about agents that we design and build, a very logical place for kind of safety mechanisms to exist in. Like if we have an agent that's just really good at Google search and molecular cloning, that's just what one individual can do. But it's a little bit different when you start leveling up like different sets of skills and chaining them together and the access on that. I think will be kind of like a future discussion, like risk at now uh, low, like risk in the future. I think it will be just like a continuing discussion as we evaluate like our system's abilities to perform different sets of experiments in biology and chemistry.
Gotcha. I'm going off script right now, so but please forgive me. I'm just curious on your thoughts. Where do you stand on artificial general intelligence? Do you think are we as close as what some companies are claiming we are, or I don't even know how anyone defines AGI at this point, but I'm just curious on your thoughts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, are we there yet? No. Um, we built our own internal systems that, unlike literature question answer, like a lot of our benchmarks that we build are, let's take a question that's come from a paper. Like let's take a paper that's been published since the last time a large language model has been trained. Ask a question that can only be answered if you read like one specific sentence in that paper. You have to understand that sentence and then respond to it. Um, our system paper QA has basically humans when we have this sort of tasks like train PhDs in biology are about like 90% accurate. And our paper QA system is basically at that level too. Like they're within the variance of each other. Does that mean that we've hit AGI in our ability to do like scientific question answering? No, but it means that we've done a pretty good job of learning the workflow of what scientists do to answer questions about the literature. And I've built systems where for an individual question, we can go and do a Google search or own DB search of dozens of papers. We can go and read those papers, summarize it by page, rank that information, what's most relevant, and then try and answer it from those summaries using a technique called RAG that probably a lot of listeners might be familiar with. Um, that process that we do there has enabled like our system in a specific case to like be pretty similar to what we can do as humans. It's flexible across hundreds of millions of papers and like different types of question types. Would I call that AGI? No. And I think like for these different pieces of, we can build systems that either meet and in some cases can like slightly exceed human ability. I mean, if you think about things like like AlphaGo. Like, yes, we've exceeded the ability of the best human Go players, but then those human Go players, this AlphaGo has played orders of magnitude more games of Go than all of humanity has combined. Of course, they found new strategies, and then the Go players have gotten better by actually seeing all these games played out and learning the strategies since AlphaGo has been released, even though they didn't release the code with it. Um, so, like on that side, I think it will be the biggest transformation though is the ability to do this at scale. Like when I try and do our like lit QA question answer set, let's say I pick 50 of them, like it would take, I'm like a slow biologist, but like it'd take me hours, like 2 or 3 hours to go and answer them all. And our system does it in a handful of minutes. So there's also kind of a transformation of like if you can make equivalent to human speed and then basically or make equivalent to human level accuracy, pardon me, and you chain them together to increase the speed, is that like AGI? I think no, but it's pretty empowering from what you're basically able to do there. And especially like the earlier piece that I was talking about of like if you can make science a flywheel and every single step, again, from hypothesis generation, experiment planning, the experiment itself, and analysis, if all of those steps are connected and you make each of those steps in order of magnitude or more faster, like at human level, if you guide it in the right way, the returns would be much more than like any individual, no matter how smart they are, basically tackling it. So I don't know if that answered your question really of where you're going there, but I think like the definition of AGI should take into consideration, and I don't have a good definition myself, is like, are we talking about superhuman performance on a wide variety of tasks? Are we talking about superhuman performance at speed? Or are we talking about combining tasks before that we never could, using like natural language as a proxy, and seeing the outputs of that? I'm not sure myself. Happy to hear from you folks, but it is something that I think about, being part of kind of the world that builds LLM agents like in biology.
I mean, it sounds like AGI is a moot point. It's really cool. It would be fantastic, amazing sci-fi to have it in our lives. But if we have the systems that makes us multiple orders of magnitude faster, better, enhanced, then who really needs an artificial general intelligence, right? Um, but that being said, I guess,
And I should have one more point too.
yeah, please.
And I think like a really important piece too, especially when we're talking about how are we making like AI agents in science, there's a throughput limit to what we can do as humans, like basically scanning for information on the safety side, like on the guardrails discussion earlier on the ethics side. Like there's an opportunity here to build into these systems from the ground up, the ability to, at the very least, evaluate capabilities when it regards to safety and biosafety, but also at the scale of what we can do here. Like, how do we both, one, build systems that can do automatic evaluation, and two, put like human in the loop for evaluation too, is really critical. Obviously, like you can learn from the good and bad of content moderation in the age of like social media, and how far that can go and where misinformation can like basically percolate. But it's not like we're going to be the first ones ever that have looked into like this general field of content moderation, like ethics for what we can at least be doing at scale. So we're trying not to go in with blinders on, and trying to learn from the best and from folks that think directly about ethics, from folks that think directly about science, and us weirdos that kind of straddle the two.
Coming from a research background, and I really agree with what you last said, and that's probably how we should approach um, basically most of the research, sort of learning from all the adjacent fields in a multidisciplinary manner. I'm curious what advice you would give to aspiring researchers hoping to make waves in this space.
Oh. What type of researchers? Junior researchers? Anybody?
Anybody who's in
Anybody.
a grad school or who is a senior in college or early career postdoc. Not
Uh,
necessarily career, but
Anything is possible with these sets of tools, and anyone can go and learn how to do it. Like, I would say that if you are determined to be able to do contributions to either AI for science or looking to accelerate the way that you are basically conducting your own biology experiments, the barrier has never been lower to being able to get started in a productive way. On like one side, there's just communities of folks that are really excited to like be using um, large language models like AI tools like in science. But on the other side, just the ability of you can now go to ChatGPT, you can go to Perplexity and ask your own custom question. And just because somebody hasn't answered it yet on Stack Overflow or Quora, get information sourced from all of human writing about what you could basically do next. Like, can you use ChatGPT? Can you use GPT-4 to basically chart unknown paths? Like, no. But if it's been done once before, you're going to be way more likely to be able to find and to get information of like, how can I do this type of experiment? You can ask questions that like basically branch fields. You can ask questions of like, if I'm working in cancer biology, like how can, this is my own example, like how can I make synthetic like glycoproteins to see the output of an experiment? And I just so happened like in my own grad school to have when I was at UC Berkeley, like UCSF, to like be collaborating with a great professor like Carolyn Bertozzi, who was able to point us in the right direction. But that just so happened that I knew that person. We're at a point now where you don't need to like know another professor, another group to be able to get new information to combine fields. You just have to have like the passion and curiosity to ask and be able to go from there. Or ask, who are the people in the field that do this? Who should I go and talk to? Like, we've never had that ability. It's never been easier to code, like, and learn and accelerate your own path and be something that can work with data and do engineering. So it's a pretty exciting time. Um, and I'm really excited. We're excited for like the communities that we're building like over here at Future House. I'm excited for like still collaborating with like old colleagues when they're curious like what we're up to. But yeah, I would say uh world's really never been more of an oyster for folks that want to dive in than like right now.
That's awesome, Matt. Thanks, Matt. So I think I'm going to move on to our last section, which is our signature questions. And so our signature question here at SuperBio is, a hypothetical future where the year is 2222. And we'd like to ask you, what do you think AI did to our lives? Are we living forever? Or is it a 1984-esque world where people are all living under one big evil corporation?
Great question. From my side, I am very motivated as like a biologist and engineer that like studies human disease primarily, and works in healthcare. I think we will in the year 20, like 2222, we'll have huge advances in our ability to one, if there is a disease, understand it, basically be able to run diagnostic tests and understand the molecular changes that are happening within our body. We'll have known that for those, what has happened over the past basically 200 years. We'll have example from like billions of human lives of when that's happened, what has been, what we hypothesized was successful interventions and what were successful interventions. And I don't think that this will lead to true longevity, but I think that for many, many diseases, like from like rare childhood diseases to like uh, cancers, that a large majority of disease will be diagnosable and treatable in a way that will like really enhance what it means to like be a human living on this world. Um, this has happened for like a handful of diseases that like we can tackle. And even for like a handful of, I mean, this has happened over the past like 70 years. There's been a handful of cancers that used to be 100% lethal that are now totally treatable and targetable. And that's just the start. Like, I think it's been an area of like a huge amount of focus. So, like, when it comes to biology and disease, I think I'm like very optimistic of that there will be really large transformations that will improve human life like across the world. When it comes to science, I think science is going to be a pretty interesting and different place where you're going to be able to ask a question and kick off untold amounts of experiments and try and get an answer back to you. Like the power of what an individual can do in science has increased by orders of magnitude over the past like couple hundred years since the Renaissance, and I think is only going to accelerate as we move forward. I think we're at like an inflection point, to be honest, of what is possible to do in science right now with our current technology. So excited in like my own lifetime to see a lot of these changes come to be too here too.
Awesome. Well, with that in mind, we always like to ask, what's next for you,
What's next for me? We're grinding at Future House.
Matt? Future House, eh?
Uh,
Yeah.
no, it's awesome working here. It's been super great. Working with like the co-founders like Sam and Andrew, like the entire team here. I work with a bunch of really talented folks, Mike Skrolinski, James, Samantha Cox, many others. And we're working on basically building different agent tools to solve those different places, like basically the different areas. And again, like the flywheel for science, like metaphor. And a lot of us are both we have the scientists are doubling down on their individual agent tools, and like my engineering team is like, how do we connect them? Uh, so there's just a lot of really cool science happening here with other organizations that we work for. So I'm just excited of where the field for AI for science is going to be going in the next 2 years, and like hope to be making a positive impact both for like how we drive this forward and also for how do we use evals for good and safety too is like a huge piece of our ethos. So yeah, we're going to put our heads down and keep on moving forward as hard and safely as we can.
I can imagine we're going to have another super bioscientist spotlight in 2 years, and you will tell us about all the crazy AI scientists, tools, and agents that you created at Future House. But this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining Super Bioscientist Spotlight, Matt.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.
Of course.